I'm Jim Rowe, and I'm going to be doing a presentation today on Anne's story. I'm here with friends Rebecca Hauger and Tom Hughes. So, Anne's story's time has come. Vermont's indomitable heroine, Anne Reynolds' story, mother of the Green Mountain Boys, aided patriots while defying local Tories and their Native American allies. Her story continues to inspire us 250 years later. So Anne's story's early years. She was born Hannah Ann Reynolds about 1737 in Preston, Connecticut. In 1755, she married Amos Story, and they had 5 children by 1769. Amos left for Vermont in 1774 or possibly 1775. In clearing land, Amos was killed when a tree fell upon him. So this is a deed from John Everts of Salisbury, Connecticut, for the plot of land that the Stories had in Salisbury, Vermont, dated March 22nd, 1775. Regardless of whether it was 1774 or 1775, Anne and her 5 children traveled through the wilderness of unsettled Vermont, following the Otter Creek to their cabin, hoping to make a life on their 100 acres in the town of Salisbury. Anne's Uncle George warned strongly against the move, with no husband to support them against troublesome Yorkers, Tories, and Native Americans. Most of the sketches of Anne depict her with a ready musket. She was said to be handy with firearms and an axe, able to fell a tree as well as any man. So this is a photo of the spring on Anne's property from 1901, and you can see how open the land was at that time. And then the cabin is a representative cabin built about 1772. It was moved to Anne Story's cabin site in time for the 1976 bicentennial. So some of the turbulent years, looking at 1776, we had the Declaration of Independence. There was the Battle of Valcour Island and the approach down to Mount Independence, Ticonderoga, and the constant danger from Tories and Indians.
Dorothy Canfield Fisher, known to Vermonters, said this: Anne's Story, as Anne's Story saw it, what she wanted for her children as Vermonters was the right to own their own land as free men and not be forced into semi-feudal subservience to rich folks, like the people who lived as tenants in New York, dependent on patroons. As Americans, what was at stake was their right to free themselves from traditional obedience to an overseas political authority over which they had no control. She was ready to stand by those causes with as forthright a civic conscience and courage as in her personal life she showed in taking care of her children.
So most of what we know about Anne is from the History of Salisbury by John Weeks, who was her neighbor for the last 28 years of her life. Weeks said he could vouch for the scrupulousness she always manifested for the truth of the stories concerning the times of the American Revolution. These exploits intrigue us the most, the material aid she rendered to the patriots, the Green Mountain Boys. So Anne's Story, the resourceful patriot spy. She reported on Tories and Native American allies. There was the Tory Ezekiel Jenny, who traveled up and down the Otter Creek.
There's a picture of him.
Shoot, Tom.
Okay. I gave evasive and dissatisfactory answers to his questions. This exasperated Jenny, and he threatened to shoot me on the spot. But to all his threats, I bid defiance and told him I had no fears of being shot by so consummate a coward as he, and finally he passed along down the creek.
So Ethan Allen and other Green Mountain Boys stopped by Anne's cabin for food, military intelligence, and stored ammunition. It's no wonder that Anne was called Mother of the Green Mountain Boys. So two of Anne's sons, Solomon and Ephraim Story, served in Green Mountain Boy regiments. This soldier roll shows them in a militia led by Benjamin Smalley, the widower who Anne married in 1792. Also in this militia was Benjamin's son Imri, who was the same age as Solomon.
In 1893, the Rutland-based chapter of the Vermont Daughters of the American Revolution picked their name. Anne's Story would be the name of their chapter. So on May 13th, 1893, 16 ladies met at the home of Mrs. Wallace Clement in Rutland, Vermont, to organize a society of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Of the original 16 ladies, only one was still living at the time that this account was made. At a meeting held on May 27th, 1893, there was considerable discussion regarding a suitable name for the chapter. Selections were read from Week's History of Vermont relating to the widow's story. They spoke of her having been a woman of fine character, very brave and persevering. She was a strong woman, able not only to wield an axe in building her home, but also to use a gun in defending that home from traders and savages. She was a resident of Rutland and Salisbury. It was voted at the meeting to call our chapter for Anne's Story.
In the war years, Anne would stay on her farm in the summer and winter in Rutland. In 1792, she married widowed Benjamin Smalley, the man who helped young Solomon bury his father. Benjamin passed in 1807, and Anne married Captain Stephen Goodrich in 1812. He was a Revolutionary War veteran who served at Bunker Hill and Saratoga. Anne passed in 1817, aged 75, and is buried in the Farmingdale Cemetery. Her original stone reads Hannah Goodrich. In 1898, the Anne Story chapter of the DAR added formerly Anne Story, the heroine of Thompson's Green Mountain Boys. And this is a monument that's at her cabin site. There was a ceremony held there in 1905, and basically what it says on the stone is, on this spot stood the home of Anne Story in grateful memory of her service in the struggle of the Green Mountain Boys for the independence of Vermont, erected by the Vermont Society of Colonial Dames, May 30th, 1905. This is a monument that's on the west bank of Otter Creek in the town of Cornwall, and it marks the spot of Anne Story's cave. And the inscription reads, 1776, this marks the site of Anne Story's cave, used as a place of refuge against the invasion of Tories and Indians, erected in honor of and for her loyalty to the Green Mountain Boys by the Mary Baker Allen Chapter, Daughters of the American Revolution, Cornwall, Vermont, 1914. And I'll just give a little description of the cave as she related to John Weeks. So Anne claims that we dug a cavern in the bank of the creek where we could retire for the night, cooking and taking our meals at the house and laboring on the farm in the daytime. This cavern or cave we made by digging horizontally into the bank of the creek, concealing the dirt we removed under the water. The passage at the mouth of the cave was sufficient only to admit our canoe, so that all must lie prostrate in passing either in or out. This passage was dug so low and so deep that the canoe could float into the cave quite out of sight. The place where we slept was higher ground and was an excavation by the side of and above the passage for the canoe, and of sufficient size to accommodate the whole family. We took the precaution to cut and stick down bushes at the mouth of the cave, both when we were in and out of it, so that the place of entrance would appear like the rest of the bank and thus prevent discovery. So in 1905 and 1914 dedications in Salisbury and Cornwall, Vermont, there are so detailed newspaper articles written at the time of the marble monuments dedicated to Anne's Story. The Honorable Fletcher Proctor gave the cabin site monument, and the cave monument also was made of Proctor marble. At the 1905 dedication, there were 1,000 people who came from all over Vermont, as well as by train from further away. Just a few names: the Governor and Mrs. Charles J. Bell from Walden, Honorable Wendell P. Stafford of St. Johnsbury, Judge Advocate General N.G. Williams, Bellows Falls, Surgeon General W.E. Putnam, Bennington, Colonel C.W. Scarf, Burlington, Colonel F.S. Billings, Woodstock, Mrs. Wallace C. Clements, and Mrs. Julia C. Dorr of Rutland. There were 200 who attended the 1914 cave site monument. The Reverend Samuel Rose of Cornwall delivered a strong patriotic address, his subject being the message of Anne's story to our time. This is a picture from the 1976 celebration at the cabin site. And as you said a little earlier, it was originally built about 1772 in the town of Addison and was purchased for $50, moved and reconstructed by the Salisbury Leicester Historical Societies. So the Rutland City had a sculpture put up in honor of Anne's story on October 19th, 2018. So there have been many books and articles written about Anne's story, notably The Green Mountain Hero in 1961. There was Trouble at Otter Creek in 1978. James Peterson did his Otter Creek book in 1990. Michael Hahn did Anne's story in 1996. Dorothy Canfield Fisher, she did a chapter in her Foursquare book. And of course, John Weeks's valuable history of Salisbury, which was published in the late 1850s. The Monuments and Memorials Tour, the Cave Monument in Cornwall, the Cabin Site Monument, the sculpture in Rutland, her gravestone at the Farmingdale Cemetery. In the Arlington National Cemetery, there's a Military Women's Memorial Tour. So in the spring of 2020, the Crown Point Road Association did a outing which I led, and one of our stops was to the Anne Story cabin site and her grave marker. And it was the tale of her cave that was most intriguing, and how hard could it be to find that 1914 marker? And turns out very hard. So eventually, we managed to get a rowboat once it was decided the best way to get to that cave monument would be to go by Otter Creek. And this is a picture of the early days before we really started doing too much clearing around the marker, and then the boat we were using, and then after the marker was cleared out. And this was another excursion that we did just over a year ago. We had half a dozen kayaks, canoes, and we went down and looked at the cave monument. And some more visitors to the cave more recently. And so in the fall of 2022, with design help from Jonas Spivak, descendants of Green Mountain Boys ordered an interpretive sign from Fossil Inc. of Long Island, New York. The plan was to place it next to the cave monument, the description of which is only visible from land. The signage allows boaters to understand what the large marble monument stands for. So myself and Tom Hughes picked up the sign, and it was stored for the winter. And help for the installation came when DGMB, Descendants of Green Mountain Boy member Harold Kenyon, visited in June of '23. So this is the view from Otter Creek. It shows the original cave monument on the left, and as we stated, the inscription is only visible from the land side, and then the new sign from Fossil Incorporated that you can read from the creek. And this was some more clearing that we did on the cabin site monument. The floods of July and August of 2023 left high water marks on the cave monument and the new signage, which need cleaning and foundation repair. We were honored with a visit from Jonas Spivak, the Vermont 250th Commissioner, now a new admirer and friend of Anne's story. We are looking forward to celebrating her life in 2026. Lastly, Anne's legacy and patriot status recognition. And it basically says Anne's story, patriotic service, Vermont, born about 1739, removed of Salisbury 1776, furnished information. So in addition to being recognized as a patriot in Vermont for a time spanning 4 centuries, Anne is listed in Major General Carleton Fisher's book, Soldiers, Sailors, and Patriots of the Revolutionary War, Vermont. The Women's Military Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery, and by the National Lineage Society, Descendants of Green Mountain Boys. We strongly urge the National Societies of Sons and Daughters of the American Revolution to join in that recognition. On the front cover of the 1905 monument dedication is the quote, "Worthy patriot, dear to God, and famous for all ages." And in Anne's own words, "I cannot live to see my children murdered before my eyes. Give me a place among you, and see if I am the first to desert my post." You want to do this one, Tom?
Well, what's next? Vermont and America's 250th anniversary celebrations are coming right up. Just months away, in many cases, with 2025 celebrations already being planned. We have met with Salisbury Select Board, informing them of our interest in the cabin site and its maintenance and accessibility. We are investigating possible replacement cabins and how that could be funded and what interest there is in recreating that. The Vermont State Historic Preservation Office has planned an Anne Story State roadside marker. The 250th anniversary is fast approaching. Planning is happening now, so we're interested in participation from the public. Let us know of your interest. Find us on the Friends of Anne Story Facebook page, and contact us through that or the Crown Point Road Association.
So thank you for your interest in the Friends of Anne's Story.